I'm Donna Hamlin, CEO of Boardwise, and I'm here with my colleague, Mike Schur.
Hi, Donna. It's good to join you.
And we are going to talk through some of the issues related to when companies hire friends. There are upsides and downsides to it, and we want to explore those. What we hope to cover starts with some of the benefits of hiring loyal friends, and then look at some of the challenges that can arise when you do that. Also, we'll talk through some of the pitfalls and challenges when loyalty is just not enough for the competencies required for the job. And talk through some of the dynamics of modern hiring, which is a shift from loyalty to innovation. We'll talk about actions and practices that you can implement to ensure that hiring is successful, and look at some of the tools and methods that help you avoid conflicted hires, or what we affectionately refer to as friendly firing. We'll use some examples to help you with handling situations when, unfortunately, loyal people need to leave, and some ways to coach and mentor early-stage company executives, because we see this happen oftentimes in that particular sector. And finally, take a look at how to navigate the political waters if you find yourself in a situation where you are managing a friend of an executive who can turn out to be quite a foe. So let's start first with this premise. Loyalty is a good thing, right? Sure, there's nothing wrong with loyalty. And if you take an example like Bill Gates, when he was interviewed years ago about the success of his company, he started with the premise that he deliberately hired friends from the beginning. He wanted to have everybody have fun building a great company where they could share the success and the rewards. Nothing wrong with that ambition. But let's take a look at the fundamental definition of loyalty. It's faithfulness or devotion to a cause, a person, or a group, which means pledging to someone or something, and that can create clouded judgment for both sides. Loyalty is an alliance or an allegiance that practices support based on your personal values. So support for an organization could be fine. On the other hand, support to a person can create distorted thinking. What we want to do is make sure that that's not a problem for the organization. So what's the difference? Some organizations like Bill Gates, built on that premise, have done spectacularly well. Others have had implosions or real rocky waters. So some companies take advantage of loyalty while avoiding the pitfalls that come with it, and we'd like to take a look at how to do that.
Thanks, Donna. That was a great introduction. We want to go a little bit back in time and think about what the employment relationship used to be like when organizations were structured more traditionally, more like the military, if you would. And very hierarchical, very linear. That's where the concept of ladders as job opportunities came about. And the essential equation, if you will, of this relationship was that the company offered a salary and tenure. In other words, there was longevity of service to consider. And in return, they got the expertise of the individual employee and therefore their loyalty. And so they were buying the expertise and they were developing and growing the loyalty as their tenure grew longer and longer. And so as the U.S., for example, in the Western world overall, was industrializing, the exchange was salary and tenure for expertise and loyalty. This was the kind of the era of the gold watch, retirement after 30 or more years of service. And you saw a lot of people really count their value as the duration that they stayed with the organization. So this is more like the old school unions that came up during the industrialization era. And of course, the longer you were in the union, the more standing you had in that organization. And a lot of that culture was transferred into the industrial organizations that developed at the time. Some of the benefits of these kinds of relationships is that when you do have social and demographic stability, in other words, you have a predictable workforce and you have a steady growth and kind of a predictable growth in the population, you can have hierarchical structures that create the economies of scale that you need in order to be able to create lots of new but standardized products. So you think about Henry Ford's old dictum about you can have any color you want as long as it's black. And that was the watchword. You could have any kind of organizational structure you wanted as long as it was hierarchical and a lot like the Army. So both of the parties' interests generally aligned with the idea of having a long-term employment relationship, because it increases both the loyalty from the individual and their expertise. And so they really did become increasingly valuable and were worth a higher salary from the organization, as well as pension benefits. But that couldn't last, right? At some point, if you had a demographic shift, you could no longer have these older employees that were tending to be more loyal to their organization. And what we have today is more of a transition to a new way of thinking about the employment relationship. So now you can think of it as salary plus development resources from the organization, and from the individual, you want their expertise, but you also want new thinking. And what's happening here is that these days, the innovation economy, everything is moving much more quickly. Things are generally much less predictable for much shorter periods of time. And so what you need to be able to do is have flexible, innovative approaches that can be more nimble when the situation changes. And this places less value on tenure and more value on being innovative, flexible, nimble, and adaptable. And so what we see is that loyalty becomes less important. And so at best, the loyalty now is between is between the employee and that employee's manager. Maybe between a team of people who tend to work together often, or because they're in a specific function. Loyalty rarely now goes to the entire organization, because people know they don't have a relationship with the organization and they won't be there long enough. One interesting thing to note is that because companies are no longer offering that tenure, and certainly the pension benefits aren't there anymore, what they do offer is the resource, or a variety of resources for individuals to continue to develop and build their skills. And that makes them more employable, not just within the organization, but actually anywhere in the economy if they can transfer those skills to different areas. And so it's important to realize that whereas companies need this kind of flexibility in order to change the composition of the kind of skills and mindsets they bring into the organization, it does also allow for individuals to continuously grow their careers and create opportunities for themselves if they take advantage of those resources.
Let's take a look at today's situation. What is it about engagement with employees today? 33% of the senior leaders believe that employee loyalty has a direct relationship to profits. And there has been a number of studies, we're citing them here, to show that in fact there is a correlation there. Customer retention rates are 18% higher on average when employees are highly engaged. And the belief in senior leadership is that the strongest engagement driver is growth and development. So if we're investing in our people and they stay engaged because of it, it creates its own form of retention. Yet, with those beliefs in mind, 34.1% of the American workers are engaged. That leaves a big delta of those that aren't. And nearly 50% of employees say out loud in survey work that they're not engaged, or they're actively disengaged. Read that as looking for someplace else to go. 29% of millennials in particular are engaged at work. That's a small number. 16% are actively disengaged, and 55%, according to Gallup, are not engaged at all. They are renting chairs. The cost of replacing an entry-level employee runs anywhere from 30 to 50% of annual salary. It's a big cost. And the cost of replacing a mid-level employee is 150% of the annual salary of the person. That's something that needs to be managed by HR to create a culture where you're not over costs when you've got budgets you have to attend to. Now let's take a look at turnover, because the stats there are also reason to sit up in your chair. Total turnover in 2014, according to data, is 15.7% of the workforce. That's a high nut to bite. 11 billion is lost annually due to employee turnover. Millennial turnover costs in the U.S. economy is $30.5 billion annually, according to Gallup. Big bucks. 44% of the millennials say if given the choice, they expect to leave their current employer in the next 2 years. So you're buying a wave of talent that you invest in to the extent that you do, so that somebody else gets the value of it later. 50% of the millennials, compared with 60% of non-millennials, strongly agree that they plan to be working in their company 1 year from now. Okay, that's only half the talent that you're buying. 53% of the employees say they will be with their current employee 1 year from now. That's again half. You're counting on turnover and churn at a very high rate. Now, the cost of replacing a high level or a specialized employee is 400% of the annual salary. Building that into your budgets is tough, and if you have to present that to your board as a cost of doing business, it's going to be a long discussion at the board table. Now, the industries that are showing the highest turnover in 2014 were hospitality, banking and finance, healthcare, and insurance. Just because you're not in those categories doesn't mean you're excused, though. It just means that those are the ones you want to watch for what experiments they're doing to bring those numbers down, or to show some best practices that you might be able to share those industries. The industries with the highest employee engagement tend to be, interestingly, heavy manufacturing and specialized financial services, where you've got a high professional advisory component to it. And the industries with the most disengaged workers in hospitality and government and light manufacturing need to be looked at for what are they doing or not doing compared to the others. 45% of the employees reported that they would be likely or very likely to look at other jobs outside their current organization within the next year, according to SHRM. That's a whole lot of free-form non-allegiance as a cultural set in today's work environment. And almost 50% of the organizations fail to even measure whether employees are engaged, particularly as it's related to their customer and the corporate brand. So what makes a difference? 60% of the HR leaders believe their companies do provide employees with a clear career path, but 36% of the employees are saying, yeah, they do. So there's a delta there of nearly half of what HR people think they're doing and what employees think they're getting. That's a cognitive dissonance that needs to be addressed. 32% of the employees have seen an increase, or employers rather, have seen an increase in retention when they in fact do increase the support for educational requirements and the development of competencies. And 25% of the employers have seen an increase in customer loyalty as a result of that increasing educational requirements. Think about it. You've got more competent employees to satisfy customer needs. You've got people who are staying there longer, who become deeper in value to the customer. It seems like an obvious, worthwhile investment.
So, with all these statistics, what is it that in this new work world that companies and organizations can do to actually foster that loyalty? Right? You don't have the traditional hierarchical structures. You don't have the gold watch at the end, so to speak. And each employee, you have to realize you can no longer say you can have any kind of career you want as long as it's this one. You really have to acknowledge and recognize that every employee is unique. There's not a single approach that will work for everyone. But we're going to go through a few ideas that you can put into practice, and that I've put into practice in some past with some past employers, and they tend to, if implemented correctly, definitely improve loyalty. So the first one, it's about offering more than just a job. What does it mean to offer more than just a job? And we're not talking pensions here. We're talking about employees who view their current job as part of a rewarding career path with their employer are naturally more motivated and invested in their work. So they may also be more likely to view necessary but tedious parts of the job in the context of the bigger picture. What we're essentially saying that is, if you don't just give an employee a set of tasks to do by rote, and you engage them in the possibility and a path for them to grow and develop, in other words, that's that developmental resources, they will then see themselves in the context that you provide and not just a day-to-day, paycheck-to-paycheck kind of existence. That does put more requirement on the organization in terms of culture and on the manager in terms of engaging with the employee, which may not be the easiest thing to do for traditional hierarchical organizations, but that is something that needs to happen in order to have an effective culture. The other way to create some goodwill is through good deeds. Now, what we mean by good deeds here is that being involved with an organization that does good in the world, right? This is the social responsibility index concept, makes the employees feel good about their jobs and their employer. So in some way, each employer supports the larger community. That's just a fact, right? We exist within the communities. We employ people from the community. We interact with various organizations. And so to develop and communicate your company's outreach efforts and community support philosophies is critical to getting employees to get on board and actually to become ambassadors within the community. You can then offer employees an opportunity to participate in those efforts or to have their own involvement in charitable causes supported by the company. So in other words, have people bring you the opportunities that exist. You don't have to rely just on your own, internal HR department or social responsibility department. Actually engage with the employees as ambassadors of your social brand. Now then, the third way is to get out your checkbook. And so what we're talking about here is you can't really buy loyalty per se, right? Intrinsic motivation is really correlated with loyalty, not extrinsic rewards. So when we talk about getting out the checkbook, you can't really buy loyalty as such, but what you can do is if you're severely underpaying people or certainly below market, then that creates this gnawing kind of undermining of the value that they're delivering. And as employees gain confidence and skills, they will see that they're not being paid what the market is dictating, and that will very much undermine the loyalty that you're trying to create and the engagement that gets your customers more satisfied. One critical thing to remember, though, is that not everything can be reduced to dollars, and not everyone has an incentive just with money. In fact, a lot of things that are intrinsic motivators, such as social responsibility, such as people who engage in creating the culture of an organization, if all of a sudden numerical rewards and dollar rewards are put to things like, build a better culture or participate in social responsibility programs, that actually destroys the motivation of the employees, because the dollars are now seen as the price of that kind of engagement, whereas people, when they put personal value onto it, it's kind of beyond just money. So it actually takes a deft hand to pay people appropriately, but not to just, shoot money where it's not appropriate and actually destroy the intrinsic motivation that people have. So the number 4 is about employee empowerment, and could easily have many hours talking about strategies for empowerment, but the overall point is that by providing a channel for employees to communicate ideas and influence, a company gives them a stake in the business's success and promotes team spirit. So empowerment doesn't just mean lip service. You can't just walk through the halls and say you're empowered while whipping them to work faster. It really does mean a two-way engagement where the employee feels heard and acknowledged and recognized for being an individual and for making a contribution. And along with that, number 5, we're talking about investing in training and development. This is probably the hardest ROI to measure, but it's also probably the best ROI that you'll get for any dollar spent in the organization. If you invest in your employees, they're more likely to invest in your company. And that we're talking about the balancing equation between salary and development resources. Those development resources cost a lot less than retention bonuses, than surprise bonuses, spot bonuses. For fairly low dollars, you can keep a whole team of people for quite a long time. And you get better employees in the process because they'll have a better understanding of your organization's business goals and business practices, and they will translate that into better performance so that your customers will get better service. Interestingly enough, this kind of training and empowerment leads to a shared vision, or can lead to a shared vision, so that if you're communicating about your company's direction and decisions, employees feel trusted and are more trusting when they know about all those decisions and what's coming up. Now, you do then have to do what you say, so that puts that onus on the leadership to be of their word. But your customers and your employees will very much appreciate when you're straight with them and you share with them the decision-making process. So then when you have these employees who share your vision and they're all trained up, you can now give them challenges. You don't have to expect the median or even kind of low expectations. You can set higher goals. In fact, my experience is that setting and meeting high expectations makes employees feel more positive about their jobs. In fact, many see stretch goals or stretch assignments as developmental in and of themselves. So you're not creating a very much a positive feedback loop so that the people who train the best and who understand the strategic direction of the organization can take on more responsibility and lead the organization in that direction. And then what you get to do is you get to recognize and reward your employees often. As Jack Welch says, do not be stingy with rewards. For a fairly modest investment, you can get basically undying loyalty. And don't always inject yourself as the manager or leader of the employee into the reward. So yes, it's great to have lunch with the CEO after a certain number of years of tenure, but it might be great to just give the employee the opportunity to take their spouse to a really nice place without you being there as well. So recognition and rewards can take different, they can look different for different employees. And of course, people do appreciate positive feedback, and they tend to be much more productive after receiving it. So the thing we reward, we get more of. The thing we punish, we get less of. And employees who are given praise, the positive effect, kind of network effects, is really like tipping over a row of dominoes. One productive employee tends to inspire and motivate coworkers by example. And as we saw, almost 2/3 of employees are actually disengaged. Now, these folks, at best, are not, they don't bring a positive charge to the culture, and at worst, are actually actively undermining and detracting from the day-to-day operation of all the other employees. When you recognize and reward often, you are putting the positive spotlight onto the positive behaviors, and everyone sees what gets rewarded, and therefore everyone does more of that. So again, don't be stingy with rewards, and especially when you can just give verbal praise, employees really greatly value that. The next strategy you can take on is finding common ground. And this is kind of a non-hierarchical or authoritarian way to align career development with company goals. So if a concession that you make for an employee is not good for both the employee and the company, it won't be good for the long term. So that means managers have to know their employees better, and they have to be able to productively share higher level strategic directions or even specific project goals with maybe more junior employees earlier. Again, this demands more from the manager, definitely being more in a coach-like stance with employees. But when those goals are aligned, you don't constantly have to kind of keep whipping the people to do the right thing. They do it because of that intrinsic motivation, and you don't have to pay them more. You just have to show them that clear path. And finally, and really this one, getting to know your employees, is the key to all the rest of these. An employee's relationship with his or her boss and their coworkers is one of the most important factors in determining how loyal that employee is and they're going to be. When you treat employees as individuals, you look for ways to foster solid relationships. So that becomes really the root of all of these other suggestions, from offering more than just a job all the way through finding that common ground. When you know the employees and they understand your goals, you'll find reason to reward them. You'll give them stretch assignments that get your vision. You'll be able to see that investing in training and development has huge payoffs. And there's some special sort of subsections or additional sections here that the study found for millennials. So this is for all employees, and for millennials, they're slightly different. They grew up in an environment that is, in a way, more technologically engaged, more socially responsible, and so their expectations may be higher than a traditional hierarchical business is prepared to meet, but these are some of the things that they expect based on the study that was done. So the first finding was that career growth and learning are valued over salary. Respondents were 2 times more likely to value career growth and learning over just salary in accepting a job. In fact, the study's originator says that millennials are clearly drawn primarily to employers that offer continued growth and learning opportunities. Increasing the salary for in-demand candidates no longer works. Today's job seekers simply cannot be bought. And it makes sense when you think of it. We're no longer competing just with people in our geographic location or within our own business. Essentially, for example, in the technical realm, every company is competing with Google, and nobody can compete with Google stock. So what you have to do is you have to be more forward-thinking, and that means going for things other than pure salary or pure stock. The next key is technology. So by implementing the latest technology is how you'll actually attract and hire millennials. So Yellow's study findings show that approximately 20% of their millennial respondents have applied for a job via their mobile device. I think the latest studies is more like 40 to 50%. On the other hand, 20% have chosen not to apply to a company solely because their career page was not mobile friendly. So you can imagine the scenario. They're surfing, essentially looking for jobs on their phones, and if they can't apply via the phone, they just don't apply, right? So you may not even see that candidate. You see them as a dropout, and it's because they cannot navigate your site very easily. Employers, on the other hand, who place an emphasis on the mobile-friendly career page and even enable applications via mobile devices can open the door to a new population of applicants who might not have otherwise considered the company, right? People do what is easiest. This is not a millennial-only trait. If you make it easy, people are more likely to come and apply. And if you're looking for millennials, if you want that innovation, if you want those perspectives, you don't have to spend a lot of money. You just have to be mobile-friendly in this case. Another factor for millennials was speed. 62% of potential employees indicated speed is a top factor in whether or not they accepted a job. So if they're applying to multiple jobs at the same time, you can imagine that the organization that gets back to them more quickly and more regularly and gives them more headlights into that future will probably do better. Organizations no longer have that luxury of thinking they're the only offer on the table. So if the company had waited any longer to make an offer, I would have accepted an earlier offer that was made to me. In fact, in my own recent history, I was bringing on a talent coordinator, and we were not paying top dollar. We did offer very good culture, and we knew she was interviewing at other places. She said that she got an offer from Oracle 48 hours after our offer, but she couldn't take it because she had already accepted ours. And so sometimes that's all it takes, is staying in touch with the individual and giving them an offer 2 days before Oracle does. The fourth point here is that recruiters are here to stay. Despite technology driving much of the job seeker's company research, recruiters still play a role in the hiring process. More than 3 in 5 respondents indicated a recruiter impacted their final decision to accept a job. In an age where recruiting software makes the hiring process more efficient and automated, recruiters can serve as a guide to keep potential employees updated and well-informed during every step of the process. And one thing to note here, you may have a wonderful applicant tracking system, and it may be the latest and greatest that, of course, the salesperson has ever installed. And let's say that implementation goes smoothly. Go in through a mobile, through the mobile access, and see what that experience is like for the mobile applicant, and then go through it for a regular platform. You think you know what that experience is like, but you don't until you go through it in a computer that doesn't have any of the cookies set, and you experience what people do, because you'll see where they drop out and where their frictions and challenges and pains come, and that will give you a lot of insight into your process. So again, technology does not replace that human touch, and if you go in yourself, you'll see how you can help your candidates throughout the entire process. And so what's the bottom line here, both for millennials and for everybody else in terms of the work relationship and how it has evolved? Here's what we're saying. Loyalty is no longer offered by the employer, nor is it expected by the employee. It's just the world we live in today. Each party, in fact, is responsible primarily to itself, or at least I would say first to itself and then to its partner. So more transformational leadership style, which focuses on working together with employees to produce superior work, leads to better organizational outcomes than a heroic leader who helms a loyal crew. In other words, loyalty to the culture and the context and the company is more effective, not just better, but more effective than simply having a heroic leader. And the fact of the matter is it's much more sustainable because a single leader can leave and the culture will crumble. But if the culture is strong, a new leader can come in and continue the tradition of the organization.
Thanks, Mike. But all of that understood, isn't loyalty valuable? I mean, Benjamin Schneider, who was a professor at University of Maryland, showed that employee loyalty-related attitudes precedes a firm's financial performance and market performance. And when companies increase their number of talented managers and double the rate of the engagement of the employees, they do achieve on average 147% higher earnings per share than their competitors. So the shift here is how to get loyalty more than the fact of loyalty itself. And what we're talking about here is, instead of the charismatic leader picking people who will stand by the leader, it's more about investing in people so that they feel that they are contributing to a cause, a goal, and success, so that their identity is aligned with outcomes as opposed to just matters of the heart. And if we're looking at that as improving the human factor, then everybody wins. It's a bottom line with lots of roots to it. So the research at Pennsylvania found that spending 10% of a company's revenue on capital improvements increased productivity by 3.9%, but investing in the same amount in developing employee capital did more than double that, an 8.5%. It seems like a no-brainer to allocate your money where you're going to get the real difference in results in the long term. If you have smarter people, sometimes they can outwit the capital improvement needs.
So if we are to get into three principles, right? We've offered some tactics and strategies and approaches, but if we were looking at principles of how to garner the loyalty of your employees, okay, the three big principles we'd have to talk about would be, one, to offer opportunities for growth, right? And again, we go back to that formula where salary plus the developmental resources, those are the opportunities for growth. Also, customizing as much as possible the working relationship and experience to each individual employee. So in other words, flexible work arrangements, whether it's in terms of time or geography or even work style, right? The level 5 leader from Jim Collins' Good to Great isn't a level 5 leader because they sit at the peak of their skill set. They're a level 5 leader because they can access any level of that skill set when that context becomes necessary. So being agile enough and insightful enough to know what to access at what time and with what employee is what makes that level 5 leader. And an example is like flexible work arrangements. And then the third principle is to recognize the employee accomplishments. It isn't just enough to have the equation go, well, here's your salary, here's the resources, goodbye, right? Good luck to you. Which is sometimes what you see with managers when they say, well, you're responsible for your own career, and then they take themselves out of the equation entirely. What the manager needs to do and what the organization needs to do is acknowledge that you get more of what you focus on and what you praise, and you get less of what you ignore and what you resist. And so recognizing employee accomplishments, saying yes, thank you to the positive things, will get you more of those things. So a little bit about offering opportunities for growth. The strategy is an obvious one, but it's also a very important one. All companies need to provide their employees with opportunities for growth if they want to see loyalty in return. And as we saw, loyalty precedes those outstanding financial returns. When you offer employees the chance to grow with you, more than likely they will want to stick around for the entirety of their career. This can be done by mentoring young workers, providing them skills training, in fact, for all employees, and assigning new tasks and responsibilities to your more experienced employees. So when those opportunities are there and they are talked about and it is assumed that people will take advantage of them, you have a culture that feeds positively on itself to make sure everybody's taking advantage and helping one another in that growth path. Flexible work arrangements, again, these are maybe very simple or straightforward principles, but they're also, if they're easy to do in a way, they're easy not to do. And so if you implement this flexible work arrangement strategy, it builds loyalty because of the particular way that the organization is adapting itself to the individual. Because we lived in very different times, people have a lot more to do outside of the office, right? So we don't have those middlemen to kind of do all the things for us, like arrange travel and such things. And so people have to do them themselves. Employees want to know that their employer is looking out for their work-life balance. And no one wants to sit in an office for 50 or 60 or more hours per week. Your organization needs to offer flexible work arrangements that allow employees the chance to work from home, for example, or leave early, or have non-traditional start and end times to the workday. If you do that, the employees will be much more resistant or hesitant before considering other offers because they have such an arrangement, kind of a comfortable arrangement worked out already. And finally, the third principle, recognizing employee accomplishments. Companies that recognize the employee's accomplishment will notice a strong sense of loyalty within the organization, and employees want to know that their work does not go unnoticed and that their time and their effort is appreciated by everyone involved. You can recognize your employees' work with formal awards, a mention at a staff meeting. You can send out congratulatory memos to an entire company or by simply thanking an employee for a job well done. Now, if you choose to say thank you, make sure it is heartfelt and sincere, not just one done in passing. So these are the three basic principles, and a lot of the other programs really fall out of those principles. And if you keep them in mind, you'll steer yourself in the right direction.
Most of what we've been talking about are the activities that you can do with larger companies once they've built up some momentum and have a larger employee base. But let's take a look at the most vulnerable first for the problems that go, the pitfalls with loyalty, which are typically the early stage companies where the founder or the innovator who starts the company is picking people based on the fact that he or she can trust those people. It's oftentimes friends that they've known for a long time, who they know will be there to support and care, and everything is well intended. It all comes from goodwill. If you have a friend and you've known the friend in the context socially that they will be there and they'll have your back, there's value to that. And there's a lot of expectation that it'll be fun to work with someone that you know and you enjoy. So what's the oops in that? Well, we talk about blind loyalty oftentimes, where people will do whatever is asked, and that has been the root cause of a lot of ethical dilemmas, where people will do what the boss asks regardless of personal values or the ethical matter that might be nagging them. It can also show up as unclear thinking about what is the best role for the person that an executive is bringing on. Just because you love the person or you know that there's loyalty there doesn't mean that they fit in the right seat for what you may have as a need for the business. And if there's selection that's based on collegiality instead of the business needs, you're going to have underperformance issues. So the assumptions here about, oh, just get Johnny on board, it'll work itself out, Johnny will be useful and we'll sort it out over time, is not as productive as thinking about the model for what competencies do you need and then matching maybe people who are loyal against competitive alternatives of people that might be strangers but could be a better performer. The other thing that happens with this is a pattern of laissez-faire communication. Because you know the person and you think you know how they think, you oftentimes don't have to say a lot. Now, granted, with deep friendships that can be true, but when it comes to business, clarity on roles, mission, performance issues is sacred to outcomes. So when we assume, we get in trouble. Now, you can build working rapport that is so good that works. I had a partner when I started my firm, and I thought I knew him. I'd known him for 7 years. We took the first year and realized, oh my gosh, we do not think alike. We don't do work alike. We have to revisit this whole thing. Now, we put a lot of time into that, and by the end of 2 years, we didn't have to talk. A contract would come in and we just in our heads knew he's going to do this part, I'm going to do that part. And people that were working for us said, how do you do that? And we said, we built 2 years of invested time in business acumen and how we think. When you're a young founding company and the executive is using that laissez-faire communication without the invested time, that's where the distress signals show up. Another problem is that when it does hit a wall on some kind of performance issue, the feedback gets a little dicey because the loyalty makes people either communication apprehensive, or they just want to overlook it and hope it'll go away, and they tend not to give clear feedback because the price of the friendship is at risk. So let's take an example of an HR leader's challenge in this, and we'll take Betsy, who's the tech support guru, and this is a real situation. She's with the company, she's been there for a year, and she's been a super successful leader of small teams. And fast forward a couple of years, and she's been promoted in place twice, and now she's a VP of services, and the job is way over her head. And the service teams don't have clear operations or strategy because Betsy still likes to get hands-on and be busy in the weeds, and frankly, she doesn't have the business acumen to design and deliver a strategic roadmap for the function that she's now managing. So this lack of leadership negatively affects sales and renewals, and her team morale sinks, but they're all pointing outside their own function as to the root cause of that. They're looking at business development or sales or the CEO for not letting them hire more service people. They all love Betsy. She's the one that got them there and gets it, and she's behaved as a beloved member of the startup executive team. So for those reasons, and possibly that the CEO doesn't assess her skills accurately and thinks she's doing a fine job, the problems are misdiagnosed and she stays in her role. Now, I had a client who described all of this and said, as a leader in 4 fast-growth high-tech startups now, I believe the biggest people challenge in the environment is not to get the right person in the job, although the staffing and assessment challenge is big. The bigger challenge is to coach the leaders and help them strengthen their ability to accurately assess the competence and the capability to make timely, objective decisions to effectively move people into the new right job, or reduce the scope if necessary, or hire over or separate from individuals who are no longer right for the role as the business grows. The reason this particular challenge is so huge in the startup environment is that people get so tight going through the war together, which creates a deepening of the loyalty bonds based on matters of their team and their psychology and their hearts. That makes objective assessment really hard to do, and compound that with the fact that they often don't know what they don't know. They're sophomoric in that, and they end up leading a larger organization than they ever had before and don't understand the changes in the needs of skills and focus for it. And this situation happens all the time in a hyper-growth environment where mere mortals can't grow in skill and perspective as fast as the company is when it's doubling in size. Okay, enter the HR pro. After researching this, you see the service functions aren't operating effectively, and you want to work with the CEO on organizational development, and you both generally get the tenets technically, say academically, but your CEO isn't with you on this conversation. You can't make the decision to shift Betsy into a different role. You need to influence Betsy and the CEO she reports to come to the realization that the company needs a person with a different set of skills leading the service, and that Betsy needs to accurately assess herself and her capabilities so that she and the CEO can determine what critical role should she shift to that brings her value fully forward. Or if there is no role for what she wants to do, maybe she needs to go to another startup company and transition out so that she uses those front-end skills again and again. Not addressing the beloved but not competent in the role leaders is one of the major reasons why startups fail. They say most startups don't make it because they run out of money, but that's not the reason. The reason they run out of money is poor leadership making poor decisions about the people. So the trick here is to focus on what competencies are important for the business early. Now, just so we're clear about the definition of competency, because that word gets used a lot, it's evidence a person is able to perform properly and effectively. And it typically is a set of demonstrable skills or behaviors and knowledge that show that you can perform at a certain level. And when we look at that, we look at it tied to excellence, accountability, and integrity. When you're stepping into an early stage company, much of this is still in the abstract level, because typically an early stage company has a product that's under test or is still under R&D, but looking at the model for the direction of the company is the first place to start. What do you need in the way of skills to be able to win? One way of looking at this is the work that was done by Ichak Adizes, and he models businesses based on the life cycle of a typical business in the same way that we would go from infancy to death in the human condition. Businesses follow a cycle like that. They don't all have to go to death. In fact, part of the principle Ichak talks about is how do you avoid that. But if you look at the life cycle from the early stage of people wooing for money because they've got an idea that they want tested, and move up into getting cash, and so you're in an infancy stage, and then you get a little bit of share of market, which is called the go-go era, and then you move up to an area where a lot of things are needed for the infrastructure development, so you're much more of a teenage mentality culture. And then you move to what's considered prime, and that's where you've got all the cylinders operating really well, and you're investing in the longer horizon of the business and keeping it young. If you hold at prime, then you've got a lot more viability for the sustainability of the company. What happens to some, though, is they get cocky, they lose that formula, and they start the slippery slope to the other side, which is when you start moving into much more aristocratic kind of model for the culture. People get protected and lazy, they start to slip, and then it's into bureaucracy and potential death. If you're looking at an early stage company, one of the things to look for is the style of problem solving that goes with people who come. There's a lot of discussion today about diversity based on gender, and we sort of come from a different view that diversity is based on orientation to the way you focus on problems and address them. If I give you a problem and there are 16 other people in the room, there could be 16 different solutions. Now, there tends to be a typology that Adizes invented as well that looks at 4 key orientations to problem solving. One is all about action, getting results. It's all about what do we need to do and how do we do it effectively. Another is how do we best do it, which is much more focused on reliable, consistent systems that are in play so that we are efficient and that customers can count on a signature statement of feeling through whatever experiences they have because it's repeatable. A third is the entrepreneurial orientation, which is why are we doing this and when are we doing it? And it's much more challenging the existing status quo to look at experimentations and innovations and new ways of approaching things. And then the fourth is the integrator, who is talking about who should be doing what, which is much more a deep understanding of the collection of talent or the composition of the talent pool to do the work. One person can't be all 4. We typically have one strong suit and maybe a wing secondary suit, but understanding the composition of the early players in a company to make sure that you've got all 4 of those represented is the key to success for most companies, particularly in the early stages, but certainly as the company grows. Another principle that's important about this is that you don't need the same combination of those 4 in emphasis at different stages of the company. So when you're in your really early stage, you need a lot of entrepreneurship because that's all about ideation and about possible ideas. As you start moving up the line, though, you start adding some of the other compositions. So you're adding more of the producer to get the results, and then you mix that up with the energy of the entrepreneur. And by the time you get up to prime, you've got all 4 represented. You need P, A, E, and I to win. As an HR leader, you want to look at that talent base in the early stage company to make sure you got that going in, and that you're scoping your talent recruitment mechanisms to make sure that you've got that balance. If you're bringing in people on loyalty and you're not thinking about this, you're going to miss And of course, looking at an early stage company when it's in courtship, yes, of course you want the ease, but when you're looking at it from a strategic planning standpoint, you think about today, but you've got to think about it from a planning horizon of at least 18 months to say, today's today, and 18 months later, what are we going to need to make sure that we're running full throttle? And so the way you create the matrix for development of recruiting of talent has to have the short view and the long view accommodated. One of the things we recommend is developing a matrix where you're looking at the competencies and the skills and the knowledge that you need today and 18 months from today. And if you can take this as an example of just a critical role in an early stage company would be the chief marketing officer. What are the required competencies of that CMO today? And then what additional competencies would be important to add to that 18 months out? And then stack the players or the potential candidates against those so that you may have a loyal person who's in the organization who's got the CMO title who doesn't belong in the CMO title if you do this matrix. They may well belong someplace else, and you can look to where that person should rotate to add value and still be a worthy contributor. But when you're taking loyalty and competency together, you're going to get a better rollout for roles and accountabilities. So if we take that as a model and you apply that, you may run some risk reduction in terms of the loyalty being a conflicted problem later.
So we're talking about ways of building these strong foundations, and we've got two principles here as well. So first thing is to vet candidates together. Right. Oftentimes, leaders, CEOs believe that, well, the prior relationship and their insights and that mutual trust, which is very powerful and very meaningful, is all the vetting that they need. And it may very well be from a practical perspective. One way to get them to think a little bit more broadly, start to get them up to the balcony, is to say the more participation the team has in this process, the more on board they will be with that individual. You are making their job here, you're increasing the likelihood that they are going to be successful. And so they want to obviously help their friend, and they want to put somebody they trust in that role. So this is a way for them to smooth the ground, so to speak, and get everybody involved. So now they're on the same team, and you don't have this friend of executive syndrome where people say, well, they're only here because of the CEO. The other people who participated in the process are going to say, well, actually, we were part of that vetting process, and this is how it went. So it builds in credibility. Of course, the other thing to do is if things at some future point go awry, and so you want to set agreements for when the unexpected happens or when people don't perform, despite either a vetting process or the past history with the CEO. And so in terms of vetting, how do you do the vetting, right? There's pieces of that as well. One is to use the competency matrix, and you have discussions about the candidates, right? So it can be objective in the sense that you set what those criteria are, but then you can have qualitative discussions. It doesn't all have to roll up to just numbers. You can weigh the value of the different competencies as well as loyalty, right? Loyalty can absolutely be one of the considerations. And then you give the different weights from an accountability standpoint, other things like respect for colleagues, engagement and responsibility towards achieving goals, through interviews and interactions. That could be structured, by the way. That often helps people get a more objective 360 perspective of this person coming in. And then open up the ground for debate and discussion, right, for long-term capability of the candidate. You want to raise all of this now. You want the team to participate because then everyone can get aligned, and you don't sort of plant these landmines for later, right? You dig them all up now, and you address them when nothing bad has happened and everybody absolutely has a positive attitude. And so then defining the roles and expectations with some detail. Right? We know you can't know everything, but you can put some of the big boulders in place, so to speak, and then review them thoroughly with the candidates so that they're clear about what's expected or needed. One of the facts is that when executives join a new company, their tenure is about 18 months on average. And usually the long is 36 months, and often that's attributed to the fact that they did not have clarity as to their expected role. And so they did not kind of stay in their swim lane. They either stepped on too many feet or they left gaps in the coverage of what was expected of them. Defining that role and the expectation, again, helps them be successful. This isn't a challenge to them. This is, in fact, again, a part of the vetting process that allows them to have the clarity to know what exactly it is they're doing, setting them up for success, essentially. But what happens when you have a team already in place? Right, so that it is great if you're brought in early, and if you have that kind of relationship with the senior leadership. But oftentimes, as you see in the image there, you're actually asked to fix the wing while the plane is already in flight, and there's lightning all around, and stormy skies have already approached us. So how do you add value in that case, right? The existing relationships are there, and the frustration has probably already surfaced, and positions may be entrenched and somewhat hardened. So very likely you'll have two camps, right? You'll have the fire and rehire. In other words, get rid of this guy, we need another guy, right? So it's the kind of magical man syndrome, right? This is just the wrong person. The other person will be right. We'll find the right one. And then there'll be the camp that says, well, you know what? This person has the capabilities. We just need to provide them the training, and usually what was left out of the vetting. And so here you will have the ability to provide some of the definitional pieces that were maybe overlooked initially in the vetting process, and you will backfill and hopefully create a bridge for everybody to, again, bring everyone along and get behind this person and help them be successful. The team can, in fact, upscale its game that way. So you don't have to rip everything out. You don't have to chop everything down and start from scratch. You can actually take where they are, build that bridge, and fill in the spots that they may have missed. It's not like going back in time, but it's like, again, doing that vetting, respecting, and discussion process that were probably missed the first time around. So essentially what HR is doing is creating the new rules of the game, and that provides for the possibility of a different outcome. So even if you weren't there the first time around, essentially the same principles apply. You just have to be that much more diplomatic, insightful, and probably have more conversations one-on-one with the various participants in order to make sure that when everyone does sit at the table, the alignment or some good part of it is already there. You definitely don't want surprises coming when no one expects them.
If we look at setting agreements ahead of time about when things go sideways, there won't be as much cacophony around it. There won't be as much stress if we've all talked about it ahead of time. Now, sometimes that doesn't happen and you've stepped into a scene and there you go. It's best if you can define how your company's going to address issues where competency isn't where it needs to be. If you agree and discuss early signs of issues openly and give feedback to the hiring manager or the reporting manager, it establishes at least some protocol for what is the likely option going forward. And typically investing in opportunities for training the person or coaching the person where it's possible if a person seems to plateau or is stuck is a good idea. But you do have to decide how coachable that person truly is. It's not the time to put rose-colored glasses on. It's the time to be as objective as possible about, does coaching the person in situ make sense, or does coaching the person and rotating the person to another role make sense, as opposed to inviting them to another company altogether. And transparency is really important here. If you're holding open discussions about how to develop deeper competencies, that's a value-based decision about investing in people. If you're way beyond that and the traction of the business is depending on speed, you may have to culturally say we can't afford to do this and we've got to do something else. But communicating to the whole company what your values are on this, and if it truly is based on investments on proficiency and professional development, you have to live it. If you say it and you don't do it, you've got an integrity issue. If you decide that you can't afford to do that because of the speed and the requirements and you've got to get best people in, then you need to say that too, so that people know what kind of culture they're stepping into. It's a psychological contract that's very important. And if you're discussing and agreeing how your company's going to address a hire that isn't working, typically it's HR's role to know, how do we support the person that we're inviting out the door? What is support? Is it just transitional services? Is it professional coaching? What things can we do that shows respect for an exiting person? And how do we establish a way that welcomes the goodwill of the rest of the organization for that person's success, even if they're not in the organization? And determine what a severance program should be that's fair and sufficient for somebody who came in with goodwill and good intention and is turning out to have topped out or just isn't the right person for scale.
It's very important to set the agreements and then follow them, as Donna was saying, because a couple of things happen, not just for the friend of the executive, so to speak, although that is the first order issue. So if the senior leader decides that they need to protect the individual from the feedback or from some of the things that people are saying, or even seeing some of the feedback that's being generated overall about them, what they're actually doing, they think they're protecting the individual. What they're actually doing is they're crippling them, because not getting that information puts them in kind of an alternate reality universe where what they're perceiving is not what they're kind of hearing, and that creates cognitive dissonance for them. What it also does is it hampers their skill development further on. So because they're not getting the feedback that they need, they don't know what to develop, and then that creates a wider and wider rift. What it also does to everyone who is not the friend of the executive officially, but an employee in some fashion, is it erodes and really eats away at the foundation that the CEO or the executive may be creating in all other aspects of their organization, but people pay a lot of attention to where the executive puts their attention and who they protect and who they reward and who they, kind of take it out on. And so whatever else they may say, people will always point to, oh, well, but that person's still here. So it's important to help early and help often instead of kind of deflecting any kind of feedback and seeing it as criticism. That'll help both the individual and the organization as a whole. Just wanted to make that comment. So then what about these friends of executives, so to speak, these foes? Because they can be perceived by the rest of the organization as antithetical to the values and the goals that the people are all striving towards. In fact, there have been instances where executives have brought their stalwarts from other organizations and other acquisitions and other contexts with them, and literally they're the only one that seems to be not reading from the same hymnal, so to speak, or singing from the same songbook. And no matter how often or with how much data or by how many people it is brought to the attention of the executive, this person seems to be getting another chance and another chance. And what the team is seeing is that results are not as important as either this person's feeling or this person's paycheck, and they're potentially blocking certain new technologies that need to be implemented, or they are unfocusing a group that actually is getting things done because they believe in the big picture and these people really want to get some very specific tactical things implemented. And that can create a very big downstream effect in terms of revenue, in terms of customer service. And so the executive really needs to be extra sensitive to the feedback and not protect anybody from what's going on in the organization. So coaching executives about the politics of these personal loyalties requires development of diplomatic skill on the part of the HR professional, for sure. One of it is one of the competencies in Lominger is managerial courage. And this is definitely one of those where the VP or SVP of HR has to reach into that bag of managerial courage and go and talk to the leader of their team and say, you've got to hear this straight from me. Now, you don't do it publicly, right? You don't spring any surprises. You set aside the time when the executive is most open and you give it to them in manageable bite-sized chunks. You don't sort of pour this whole bucket of cold water on them and hope that they say, thanks you very much, can I have another? So trust your judgment, but make sure you're developing this judgment the whole time. And so some of the things you'll have to get across to them is that blind loyalty hurts. Is that while loyalty is a good quality and a trait to foster, when it's blind and when it's kind of unthinking and unself-aware, it actually tarnishes not just the individual, but the executive themselves. And so there's that heavy price to pay. And they may not have a lot of self-awareness about it, so you may need to bring that up in stages. In terms of the emotions that are generated, be ready to let them run their course, right? And you don't want to kind of protect the executive from their own reactions to this, right? Let them run through allow for them to run their course, then you can circle the discussion back into a more kind of rational approach. Don't be triggered, right? They're not angry at you. It's just that they're trying to understand a situation that until now has been somewhat oblique to them. They're also dealing with the loss of the underlying friendship. They brought the person along because of their experience and their trust in them and the belief, and they feel like, well, if I move them or, God forbid, fire them, our wives know each other, we go to the same country clubs, our kids go to the same schools, it's my life against my business, right? And now it's this big choice. You've got to let them feel all the way through that as well and help them understand that that is not the case, right? That you don't want to conflate and intermix these two things. And that was the risk, by the way, that they were running. So again, this is an opportunity for them to grow from that experience. Conflict aversion in terms of delaying what is necessary. So most people are in some way conflict avoidant, and even the ones who like a bit of that scrapping usually do it from the position of, right, a good attack is better than a prudent defense. So very often avoid the underlying conflict in order just to have a nice, round of, spirited discussion. So it has to be made clear that not making a decision is making a decision to allow the current situation to persist, and it does harm their credibility with respect to the board, with respect to shareholders, and certainly with respect to customers. So using HR as the kind of emotional armor for the executive, or as we say here, as the hatchet, right? The hatchet man who comes in and lays it out straight. Once again, it does not build the executive's credibility. It is much less likely to be perceived as valuable or positive feedback by the friend of the executive. And what you're really doing is you're now setting up another layer of defenses and conflict avoidance instead of really just manning up and doing it yourself. And not just, manning up, but really understanding what the executive's reaction is to this, and then taking accountability for that emotional reaction. And so working together with dignity for the individual is constructive. It isn't feedback as criticism, right? Very often the word feedback is heard as criticism, or, the old, the unpleasant sandwich, where you start with something good. Hey, you look really great today. And then you say you're completely incompetent. And then you end with, and your shoes are shiny. And so the individual seems to walk away with saying, I think that guy likes me. And what you really just said was, you're about to be fired. And so this is how this contrary impression is made. And then you're seen as essentially duplicitous, and people start to not trust you in other contexts. And the individual is wondering why they got fired. So you need to be able to...
So to chime in on that, if you miss the opportunity to set up some of that discussion about the politics and educate the executive on the pitfalls here, here's some things you can do. If, in fact, you have to play a role with the exit of somebody, it's a delicate walk to say to that person, I'm about to be your best friend. I'm here to help you with the success of your transition. Now, you don't want to make that come across as though you're doing that in substitution for the friendship that person already has with the CEO. It has to be additive. You're not standing in and you're not taking sides with that person against the CEO, and it has to be done with a lot of careful language. But it has to be credible enough that that person knows you've got that person's back. And you're there to help with the transition. And this is a mistake that a lot of people make. Once the person's out, there's no follow-up. If you do this right, you're checking in on that person for at least 6 months afterwards to see how they're doing, where they've landed, are they happy? You really are honoring that relationship for a long haul, independent of what happened in that past. If you do that, you've created goodwill for that relationship. You've also created goodwill for the brand, and you've kept the sustainability of the friendship for the executive in tow. And that's really important.
So we've got a new view about loyalty in all of this, right? We started out with loyalty simply meaning, or kind of being equivalent to the tenure that one had with an organization. And then we had organizations that were less hierarchical and much more were about individual relationships between an employee and a manager. So we had this heroic manager appear, and all of the loyalty all of a sudden went from the culture and the organization to the manager. And now we're seeing the evolution of a new kind of loyalty. So it's a shift from that personal loyalty of the manager to employee engagement overall, right? And why are we seeing this? Really here, it's not one extreme or the other. What we're seeing is a kind of balance and a marriage of the new loyalty with competency. In fact, each side of this equation, they feel that they need to balance the tension so that, for example, the employee needs to continuously develop their skills, not just for themselves, but in order to constantly give more value to the organization, which provides them new opportunities and new development and so on in a positive cycle. At the same time, the organization sees that, yes, they have quality and they have competence and innovation from the employee, and the more opportunities they provide internally for them to develop, the more value they will bring back to the organization. And so it's from a static relationship of here's how it is, it's become much more of an intertwined relationship where each manager will provide a quality leadership experience, and it's the organization that provides the culture and the context that everybody can actually be their best and not be afraid of loss or giving too much, so to speak. So it's much more of a balance of that tension where we both give in order to receive in the long term.
The question really is, if we want to talk about balance, how do you evaluate how balanced your organization is today and what needs to be done if it isn't in balance? And we recommend that you, as the thought leader in HR, assess the healthiness of your organization today on those dimensions. And if you identify that there are gaps or potential needs going forward, that you bring that forward to the executive team and talk about it so that you can address it versus maybe scrambling when things hit. And one of the fair options is not every answer has to come from inside the system. You may look at things that are gaps or potential pitfalls later that you can get outside support for to come in and shore up. And oftentimes getting professional assistance in those gaps is the best and cleanest and swiftest way to get the culture to mature and honor the way that they're going to go forward on a values-based notion.
And that's a great point, Donna, where you can go outside to get help for somebody who's inside. There's one instance where there was an executive, a marketing executive, who was doing a tremendous job and adding an incredible amount of value. And what was tripping him up was his speaking style. In fact, one of the C-suite executives described his speaking style as nobody puts so little information in so many words. And so this person would present a 15-minute topic, but it would take him an hour and a half. And people would absolutely want to, put a fork in their eye before getting into a meeting that this guy was running. And what we did, we had a great vendor that we worked with in a nearby major city that did communication training with peers. Not just, kind of everybody's in this big room and they get the video training, but there were peers who were able to give feedback to that executive about his performance. And so after a 3-day, I think it was a 3-day training, and he fought it, he wouldn't do it, he was too busy, he realized that those 3 days weren't just going to pay off for him and continue to allow his career to go up within the organization or any other. He had his whole team of direct reports also go through that program because he realized that, he happened to come out of an engineering organization. Most of the people reporting to him did the same, that their technical skills, when married with very good communication and kind of media-ready presence, were going to stand them in good stead and make his organization that much better. So it doesn't all have to come from in-house. If you have really good partnerships from the outside, they can make a huge difference. And the person who suggested that he take that kind of training was his biggest backer. Because in fact, people who give you that kind of feedback care enough and see where the gaps are to help you close them. So we really had a great supporter then, instead of someone who could have been a detractor if nothing had been said.
And all of that leads to our last slide. You can see our number there. If you want to call and think out loud with us, we're here to do that. Thanks so much for taking the time.